100 mechanics had spent 6 hours trying to start the Ferrari. By noon, the workshop no longer felt like the most respected Ferrari restoration facility in the state. It felt like a room full of people running out of explanations. Diagnostic computers were connected to the car. Wiring diagrams covered workbenches. Senior technicians moved from one theory to another, while engineers debated fault possibilities beside the open engine bay. Every test returned the same result. Every attempt ended exactly where the previous one had ended. The Ferrari remained silent. The timing could not have been worse. In less than 90 minutes, investors would begin arriving at Moretti Prestige Motors for the unveiling of what CEO Isabella Moretti had spent nearly 3 years building. The bright red Ferrari, positioned beneath the inspection lights, was worth over $12 million. Collectors from across the country were flying in to see it. Automotive journalists were already setting up outside the facility. The unveiling was supposed to establish Moretti Prestige Motors as one of the premier Ferrari restoration houses in North America. Instead, the centerpiece of the entire event would not start. Isabella stood beside the Ferrari with her arms crossed, listening as another senior technician explained why his latest diagnostic attempt had failed. She had heard variations of the same explanation all morning. Every mechanic who approached the car sounded confident at the beginning and uncertain at the end. By now, nearly 100 specialists had examined the vehicle. Factory-trained Ferrari technicians, restoration experts, electrical engineers, performance tuners. None of them had solved it. The atmosphere inside the workshop grew heavier with every passing minute. Then a pickup truck pulled into the service entrance. Nobody paid attention. Compared to the crisis unfolding around the Ferrari, a routine delivery meant nothing. The driver stepped out wearing a faded grey work jacket and carrying an invoice folder under one arm. His name was Daniel Carter. Most people who saw him would have assumed he was exactly what he appeared to be. A small independent mechanic making a scheduled parts delivery before returning to his own workshop. Daniel walked inside, delivered the paperwork, collected the required signatures, and was halfway back toward the exit when he noticed the crowd surrounding the Ferrari. He slowed, not because of the car, because of the people. A room full of experts looked confused. Daniel listened quietly as a technician described another failed test procedure. An engineer proposed a new theory. Another specialist immediately disagreed. The conversation had the sound of people searching rather than knowing. Daniel watched for less than 30 seconds. Then he smiled slightly, the kind of smile that appears when someone recognizes something familiar. Finally he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the nearest mechanic to hear. "I think I know what's wrong." The conversation stopped. Several heads turned. One, a mechanic, laughed. Another folded his arms. A third looked genuinely annoyed. CEO Isabella Moretti studied Daniel for a moment. Her eyes moved from his work jacket to the invoice folder in his hand and then back to his face. "You know what's wrong with my Ferrari?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "I think so." The laughter grew louder. A few technicians exchanged looks. One engineer actually shook his head. After all, nearly 100 professionals had already failed. Why would a delivery driver succeed where Ferrari specialists could not? Isabella looked directly at him. Then she said the sentence everyone in that workshop would remember later. 100 mechanics and nobody can fix this Ferrari. Daniel nodded politely, then he smiled. "Oh?" A brief pause. "But I can fix it in just 3 minutes. 3 minutes later, the Ferrari started. And nobody in that workshop would ever look at Daniel Carter the same way again. Before I tell you how a single dad solved a problem that 100 Ferrari experts couldn't, hit that subscribe button. If you enjoy stories about hidden genius, impossible challenges, and the moments that completely change the way people see each other, you're in the right place. And tell me in the comments, what's the most expensive thing you've ever seen break at exactly the wrong time? Now let me take you back to the beginning, back before the Ferrari, back before the workshop, back to a quiet morning, a small garage, and a little girl named Emma, Daniel Carter woke at 5:23 every morning without an alarm. The habit had survived long after the circumstances that created it. Years earlier, when life had been measured by deadlines, restoration schedules, and clients waiting on impossible projects, waking before sunrise had been necessary. Now it was simply part of who he was. He liked the quiet. He liked the hour before the world became noisy. He started the coffee maker, checked the weather through the kitchen window, and prepared breakfast. Emma's oatmeal went into the small blue bowl she had insisted on using since third grade. Orange juice in the short glass. Vitamins on the saucer beside it. The routine never changed, not because Emma required it, because Daniel understood something many parents missed. Children built security from consistency. At 6:15 he knocked twice on her bedroom door. Never once, never 3 times. Twice the door opened 11 seconds later. Emma appeared carrying her notebook. She was 10 years old and had inherited her mother's eyes and Daniel's habit of paying attention to everything. The notebook had become part of her life 3 years earlier. Nobody remembered exactly how it started. One day she simply began writing things down. Questions, observations, lessons, funny conversations, things she didn't want to forget. She brought it everywhere, including breakfast. Emma sat down at the table and immediately opened the notebook. Daniel smiled.
Anything important happen overnight?
Emma looked up. I had a dream that a Ferrari was parked in our driveway. Daniel poured coffee. Was it running? Emma thought about it. No, then it was definitely a dream. She laughed and wrote something in the notebook. Daniel didn't ask what. He stopped asking a long time ago. Eventually she always showed him, just never immediately. Emma looked across the table. Daniel nodded. Parts delivery this morning. Big customer. A Ferrari restoration company. Emma's eyebrows lifted. The fancy one? Daniel knew which one she meant. There was only one Ferrari restoration facility in the state that people talked about the way collectors talked about it. Moretti Prestige Motors, luxury clients, multi-million-dollar restorations. Industry awards, magazine covers. The kind of place ordinary mechanics discussed with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Daniel nodded. That one. Emma wrote something else in the notebook. Will you be back for pickup? 3:15 RT. Same as always. Same as always. She seemed satisfied by that answer. The conversation ended there because neither of them felt a need to continue it. Some relationships required constant talking. Theirs didn't. The important things had already been established. Carter Restoration sat on Harbor Lane at the edge of the industrial district. The building wasn't impressive. 3 bays, a small office, a weathered sign above the entrance. Most people driving past would never guess what happened inside, which was perfectly fine with Daniel. The workshop had never been built to impress strangers. It had been built to do good work. The interior reflected that philosophy. Every tool had a place. Every workbench was organized. Parts were catalogued and labeled. Project notes filled several binders arranged alphabetically along a shelf near the office. Nothing looked expensive. Everything worked. A partially restored Ferrari 308 sat in Bay 1. A Porsche 911 occupied Bay 2. Bay 3 held an old Jaguar E-Type waiting for paint correction. Daniel moved through the workshop performing his normal morning checks, fluid levels, correct schedules, parts inventory. Nothing dramatic, nothing exciting, just the work. The kind of work most people never noticed because it was done correctly. At 8:10, he loaded the delivery parts into the truck. The shipment itself wasn't complicated. Several specialty components Moretti Prestige Motors had ordered through one of Daniel's suppliers. A routine delivery, one of dozens he made every year. He secured the parts, checked the paperwork, and climbed into the driver's seat. The drive across town took 26 minutes, long enough for a podcast, short enough not to matter. By 9 o'clock he was pulling through the service entrance of Moretti Prestige Motors. Even after 17 years in the industry, the facility remained impressive. The workshop was enormous. Glass walls, polished floors, rows of exotic cars, technicians moving between bays. The kind of operation built by someone who expected excellence and invested heavily to achieve it. Daniel parked near the loading area and stepped out carrying the paperwork. He expected to spend 10 minutes there, 15 at most. Deliver the parts, collect signatures, drive back to Harbor Lane, finish work on the Porsche, pick up Emma at 3:15, a completely ordinary day. At least that was the plan. What Daniel didn't know was that the largest crisis in company history was unfolding less than 50 feet away, and before the morning was over, every mechanic in that building would know his name. But at 9 o'clock, he was just another delivery driver walking through a workshop door, and nobody paid attention. Not yet. Isabella Moretti had spent 3 years preparing for this day. Not continuously, not every hour of every day, but every major decision she had made during those 3 years had been connected to the Ferrari currently sitting in the center of Bay 1. The project had started as an opportunity and gradually transformed into something much larger. The car itself was extraordinary, a rare Ferrari valued at over $12 million. One of the most significant restorations Moretti Prestige Motors had ever undertaken. The kind of vehicle that attracted attention from collectors before it even arrived and generated speculation throughout the restoration process. Clients had called asking about it. Industry publications had written about it. Investors had followed it. Competitors had quietly monitored its progress. By itself, the restoration represented years of work. What happened today would determine what that work was worth. The unveiling event had been scheduled months in advance. Invitations had gone out to collectors, investors, journalists, and several high-profile clients, whose future projects represented millions of dollars in potential business. Everything had been planned, every detail, the presentation area, the lighting, the guest schedule, the catering, the media coverage, the demonstrations. The car would be unveiled at 2 o'clock, the engine would start, the guests would hear it run, photographs would be taken, articles would be written, new contracts would follow. At least that had been the plan. At 7:42 that morning, the Ferrari refused to start. Initially nobody worried. Luxury vehicles occasionally developed minor issues after extensive restoration work. The lead technician assumed it was something simple. A loose connection, a sensor issue, a calibration error, the kind of problem that required 10 minutes and a wrench. By 8:15 the problem still existed. By 8:30, 3 technicians were involved. By 9, an entire diagnostics team surrounded the car. The confidence inside the workshop began to change, not dramatically, subtly. The way confidence changes when people expect to find an answer and keep finding nothing. The first round of diagnostic testing revealed no obvious fault. The second round revealed even less. Every critical system appeared functional. Fuel delivery checked out. Ignition systems checked out. Electrical systems checked out. Battery systems checked out. Control units checked out. Everything appeared normal. The Ferrari simply refused to start, which was somehow worse. Mechanical failures at least gave you something to fix. This gave them nothing. By 10 o'clock Isabella had cancelled her entire morning schedule. She stood near the Ferrari while specialists moved around it with increasing urgency. Her operations director arrived with updates every 20 minutes. None of them were good. Additional Ferrari technicians had been contacted. Senior engineers had been called in. FECTI-trained specialists were reviewing diagnostics remotely. Nobody had an answer. The atmosphere inside Moretti Prestige Motors became noticeably different. Conversations grew shorter. Movements became faster. Employees who normally carried themselves with confidence now avoided eye contact with management. Everyone understood what was happening. The company had built its reputation on solving difficult problems. And today, on the biggest day in company history, they couldn't solve their own. At 11:15, a senior Ferrari engineer from another state joined a video conference. He reviewed every diagnostic report generated that morning. Every test, every measurement, every procedure. 47 minutes later, he ended the call with the same conclusion everyone else had reached. I don't know. Those 3 words landed harder than any technical explanation could have, because they came from someone who normally always knew. The workshop grew quieter. Isabella stood beside the Ferrari, looking at a vehicle she suddenly hated. Not because there was anything wrong with it, because it had become the center of a problem she couldn't control. Control mattered to Isabella. Preparation mattered. Competence mattered. The Ferrari was violating all three. By noon, additional specialists had arrived. Number of mechanics, technicians, engineers, and consultants who had examined the vehicle now exceeded 50. Soon it would exceed 70. Eventually it would reach 100. The results never changed. The Ferrari remained silent. Meanwhile, outside the facility, life continued according to schedule. Media trucks arrived, clocks checked into nearby hotels, investors confirmed attendance. Nobody knew there was a crisis unfolding inside the building. Yet inside the workshop, however, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Every person present could feel it. Every failed attempt made it worse. Every new theory increased expectations and deepened disappointment. The problem had stopped being mechanical. It had become psychological. People were no longer simply trying to repair a Ferrari. They were trying to save a day, a company, a reputation. And that kind of pressure rarely improves anyone's thinking. Just after 12:30, Isabella listened as another specialist explained another theory. A wiring issue. Before that it had been a sensor issue. Before that an ECU issue. Before that a fuel pressure issue. The explanations kept changing. The outcome never did. The Ferrari would not start. Then the service entrance opened. A delivery truck arrived. Nobody cared. A parts delivery meant nothing compared to the crisis consuming the workshop. Several employees barely looked up. A technician signed paperwork. A loading supervisor processed inventory. Business continued. The driver walked inside carrying an invoice folder. Ordinary, forgettable. Exactly the kind of person nobody notices during a disaster, which was unfortunate. Because while everyone inside Moretti Prestige Motors was staring at the Ferrari, the only person who actually understood the problem had just walked through the door. By 1 o'clock, the Ferrari had become the only thing anyone in the building was thinking about. The unveiling event was now less than an hour away. Guests would begin arriving soon. Clocktricks were already checking in with the reception staff. Journalists were setting up cameras outside. Investors were being escorted toward the conference suite, where the afternoon presentation would begin. Everything was proceeding according to schedule, except for the one thing that actually mattered. The Ferrari still wouldn't start. The number of people who had examined the car had now crossed 100, not 100 employees, 100 experts, Ferrari certified technicians, restoration specialists, electrical engineers, performance tuners, quicsit consultants, men and women whose entire careers had been built around solving problems exactly like this one. The workshop floor looked more like a command center than a restoration facility. Diagnostic laptops covered nearby workbenches. Technical documents were spread across tables. Wiring schematics hung from magnetic boards. Conversations overlapped from every direction, and yet despite all the activity, progress had completely stopped. Every new idea led back to the same place. Nothing. The Ferrari sat beneath the lights exactly as it had 6 hours earlier, silent, motionless, uncooperative. The atmosphere inside the room had shifted from confidence to frustration, and from frustration to something dangerously close to embarrassment. Nobody wanted to say it aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. What if they couldn't fix it? What if the unveiling happened without the car? What if investors saw the company fail on its biggest day? Isabella Moretti stood near the vehicle listening to another senior engineer explain a theory involving a possible communication fault between two control systems. He sounded intelligent. He sounded qualified. He sounded exactly like the previous 12 people who had explained why they thought they understood the problem. 10 minutes later, his theory failed, like all the others. The engineer stepped back from the car and removed his glasses. No one said anything. There was nothing left to say. Across the workshop, Daniel Carter stood near the service desk waiting for a final inventory confirmation signature before leaving. Technically, he should have been gone already. The paperwork was complete. The delivery was complete. Everything that brought him there had been finished nearly 20 minutes earlier, yet he remained. Not because he was curious about the Ferrari, because he was curious about the people. There was a difference. Daniel had spent 17 years repairing cars. He knew what confusion looked like. He knew what certainty looked like. Most importantly, he knew what happened when too many intelligent people started looking in the wrong direction at the same time. The longer he listened, the more familiar the situation felt. Not the Ferrari, the process. Everyone was searching for complicated answers. That usually meant the problem wasn't complicated. Daniel quietly watched another diagnostic discussion unfold, then another, then another. Eventually, he looked toward the open engine bay and noticed something, not a fault, not yet, just something worth checking, a possibility, the kind of possibility experience teaches you to recognize. A nearby mechanic noticed him watching. "You need something?" Daniel smiled. "No." The mechanic returned to work. A few minutes later, another technician walked past. Daniel asked a simple question. "What have you ruled out so far?" The technician looked tired. "Everything." Daniel nodded. That answer interested him, because nothing mechanical ever ruled out everything. A second technician overheard the conversation. "You got an idea?" The question was sarcastic. The tone made that clear. Daniel shrugged. "Maybe." The technician laughed, not cruelly, just dismissively, the way professionals laugh when someone outside their field suggests something obvious. Within a few minutes, word somehow spread. The delivery driver thought he had an idea. One mechanic mentioned it to another. That mechanic mentioned it to someone else. Soon several technicians were looking toward Daniel, most of them amused, a few annoyed, one openly entertained. Daniel didn't seem bothered. He simply continued observing the Ferrari. Finally, a senior technician approached him. "You think you know something 100 mechanics missed?" Several nearby employees stopped what they were doing. The question attracted attention immediately. Daniel thought about it, then answered honestly, "I don't know what they missed." The technician crossed his arms. "Then what are you saying?" Daniel glanced toward the Ferrari. "I'm saying I think I know where I'd start." That response somehow irritated people even more, because it sounded reasonable, and because nobody in the room wanted another theory. They wanted a solution. The senior technician shook his head. "We've been starting places all morning." A few people laughed. Daniel nodded politely. Fair enough. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, Isabella overheard the exchange. She turned. For the first time all day, she actually looked at the man standing near the service desk. Average height, work jacket, invoice folder, delivery paperwork. Nothing about him suggested Ferrari expertise. Nothing about him suggested engineering brilliance. Nothing about him suggested he belonged in this conversation, which made his confidence seem ridiculous. Isabella walked over. The workshop became noticeably quieter. People always paid attention when she moved, especially today. She stopped a few feet from Daniel. "You think you can help?" Daniel met her eyes. "I think I might." A few technicians exchanged smiles. Others folded their arms. One engineer actually laughed. The situation had become absurd. 100 professionals had failed. Now a delivery driver wanted a turn. Isabella studied him for several seconds, then looked around the room. The Ferrari remained dead. The clock continued moving. The event continued approaching. Nothing else was working. "What exactly do you think is wrong?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "I'd need to look at it." More laughter. Louder this time. One mechanic muttered something about miracles. Another walked away entirely. The workshop had reached the point where frustration was turning into sarcasm. Daniel remained calm through all of it. That was the part Isabella noticed. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't performing confidence. He simply looked like a man discussing a routine mechanical problem, which made no sense, because nothing about today was routine. Isabella looked at the Ferrari, then at the countdown clock on the presentation schedule, then back at Daniel. Finally, she sighed. The sound of someone running out of better options. "Fine." The room went silent. A few employees actually stopped moving. Nobody expected that answer. Isabella pointed toward the Ferrari. Daniel smiled, not because he was excited, because 3 minutes was more time than he needed, and for the first time all day, the Ferrari finally had the attention of the right mechanic. The workshop became quiet in a way that large workshops rarely become quiet, not silent expectant. 100 professionals stood around a Ferrari that none of them had been able to fix, watching a man in a faded, grey work jacket walk toward it as if he were approaching an ordinary service appointment. Nobody knew what to do with that level of calm. Daniel handed his invoice folder to the service desk and slowly approached the vehicle. No dramatic entrance, no speech, no performance. The crowd parted just enough for him to reach the open engine bay. Several mechanics folded their arms. Others positioned themselves closer. Engineers who had spent the entire morning running diagnostic procedures now watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to irritation. Isabella stood near the front of the group. 3 minutes, that was what she had given him. Not because she believed he could solve the problem, because she no longer cared who tried. The clock was winning. Daniel reached the Ferrari and stopped. Then he did something that immediately confused everyone. He didn't touch anything. He simply stood there, looking for several seconds. He said nothing. His eyes moved slowly across the engine bay, fuel system, electrical system, control modules, harness connections, vacuum, routing, sensors. Nothing rushed, nothing random. The inspection had a pattern. A senior technician exchanged a look with one of the engineers. This wasn't how diagnostics were normally performed, at least not publicly. Daniel leaned slightly closer, then stepped around the side of the vehicle, still saying nothing, still touching nothing. The crowd continued watching. A minute passed. One mechanic glanced at his watch. Another shook his head. Someone in the back whispered something about wasting time. Daniel ignored all of it. He moved to the driver's side, looked through the window, looked back at the engine, then finally reached forward and placed 2 fingers on a component near the rear section of the engine bay. Not a major component, not one of the systems everyone had spent the morning investigating. Something small, something almost forgettable. His fingers remained there for 3 seconds. Then he smiled very slightly. The same smile he had worn earlier when he first overheard the discussions. A nearby engineer noticed it. "What?" Daniel looked up. "Who checked this?" The engineer frowned. "Checked what?" Daniel pointed. A few mechanics stepped closer. The component he indicated seemed almost absurdly insignificant compared to everything that had already been examined. The engineer looked at it, then looked at Daniel, then back at the component. "It isn't the problem." Daniel nodded. "I know," the engineer blinked. "Then why are you looking at it?" Daniel straightened. "Because it tells me where the problem is." Several people exchanged confused looks. That explanation somehow made less sense than before. The engineer frowned. "Explain." Daniel glanced around the crowd. Nearly everyone was watching him now. 100 mechanics, dozens of specialists, all waiting. "The reason you've been struggling," Daniel said calmly, "is because you've been trying to find what's broken." Nobody responded, Daniel continued, "but nothing is broken." The statement landed strangely. Several technicians immediately disagreed. One laughed outright. The Ferrari clearly wasn't working. Something had to be broken. Daniel shook his head. "No, you're dealing with a perfectly functioning system that's receiving the wrong information." That got their attention, because it matched the diagnostic reports. Every major system had tested correctly. Every component appeared functional. The data made sense. The outcome didn't. Daniel pointed toward a small connection hidden beneath a section of the harness routing. Most people couldn't even see it from where they were standing. That connector. A technician crouched beside him. The technician stared, then frowned.
"That's impossible."
Daniel nodded. "That's why nobody checked it." The crowd moved closer. Now even Isabella stepped forward. The connector itself wasn't damaged. It wasn't disconnected. It wasn't broken. At first glance, it appeared completely normal. The problem was much smaller than that. A manufacturing variation. A tiny alignment issue. Barely visible. Small enough to escape every computer diagnostic procedure used throughout the morning, small enough to survive every automated test, small enough that 100 mechanics looking for major failures would never think to investigate it. Daniel looked at the technician beside him. "May I?" The technician immediately stepped aside. Daniel reached into his pocket. Not for a scanner, not for a diagnostic computer, not for specialized Ferrari equipment, for a small precision tool, the kind of tool mechanics carried every day. The room watched. Nobody spoke. Daniel made a tiny adjustment. Less than 5 seconds, then another, even shorter. When he finished, he stepped back. The entire repair had taken perhaps 20 seconds. The crowd stared. Several mechanics looked disappointed. That couldn't possibly be it. After 6 hours, after 100 experts, Daniel closed the engine cover, then turned toward Isabella. "You can start it now." The room froze. Nobody moved. Several people actually looked nervous. Hope had become dangerous after an entire day of disappointment. Isabella looked at him, then at the Ferrari, then back at him. Sure? Daniel smiled, the same calm smile. "Pretty sure." One mechanic quietly muttered that it wouldn't work. Another nodded in agreement. The engineer who had argued with Daniel earlier folded his arms and prepared himself for another failure. Nobody wanted to believe the answer could be this simple, because if it was, then everyone in the room had spent 6 hours looking in the wrong place. Isabella slowly walked toward the driver's door. The workshop watched. The investors would arrive soon. The journalists were already outside. The unveiling schedule was hanging by a thread, and the next few seconds were about to determine whether the biggest day in company history became a disaster, or something nobody in that building would ever forget. Nobody moved. For several seconds the workshop remained completely still. 100 mechanics, engineers, technicians, managers, everyone standing around the Ferrari waiting for something they no longer trusted themselves to hope for. After 6 hours of failure, optimism felt dangerous. Every previous attempt had begun with confidence and ended with disappointment. This felt no different, at least to everyone except Daniel. He stood beside the Ferrari with his hands relaxed at his sides, looking completely unconcerned. The contrast was almost unsettling. The most stressed people in the room were the experts. The least stressed person was the man who had supposedly solved the problem. Isabella noticed that immediately. She walked toward the driver's door. The crowd instinctively stepped back to give her room. Her hand rested on the handle for a moment, not because she was nervous, because she was trying not to be disappointed again. Then she opened the door and sat inside. The workshop watched. A few mechanics folded their arms. Others stared at the engine bay. Several engineers exchanged skeptical looks. Nobody said anything. The silence felt enormous. Isabella placed her hand on the ignition. Then she turned the key. The Ferrari started instantly, not eventually. Not after hesitation, not after struggle, instantly. The engine exploded to life. A deep mechanical roar filled the workshop. The sound echoed through every bay. Several employees actually jumped. One mechanic's mouth literally fell open. Another looked toward the engine as if he had just witnessed something physically impossible. The Ferrari settled into a smooth idle. Perfect. Stable. Flawless. The same car that had spent 6 hours refusing to cooperate now sounded as though nothing had ever been wrong. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the only sound inside the workshop came from the Ferrari itself. Then Isabella shut the engine off. Silence returned. The difference was that this silence felt completely different from the previous one. The first silence had been confusion. This silence was shock. Every person in the room was trying to process the same reality. The car was fixed. The delivery driver had fixed it. In less than 3 minutes, a senior technician immediately rushed toward the Ferrari. Another followed. Then an engineer. Within moments, several people were examining the exact area Daniel had touched, looking, measuring, inspecting, trying to understand what had happened. The technician who had first questioned Daniel's diagnosis stared at the connector, then looked at Daniel, then looked back at the connector. "You've got to be kidding me." Daniel smiled. "No." The technician shook his head. We checked this. Daniel nodded. I know. We checked it 3 times. I know. The technician looked genuinely frustrated. Then how did we miss it? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the workshop. Nearly every person present was watching him, waiting. The question wasn't really about the connector anymore. The question was bigger than that. How had one man succeeded where 100 experts had failed? Daniel finally spoke. You didn't miss it. The technician frowned. What? Daniel pointed toward the Ferrari. You found it, you just dismissed it. Several engineers exchanged looks. Daniel continued. Everybody was looking for a major failure. Something dramatic, something expensive, something complicated enough to justify 6 hours of diagnostics. The room remained quiet. Daniel looked at the connector. The problem wasn't complicated. A few people understood immediately, others didn't, Daniel continued. The more experience people have, the more likely they are to expect complicated answers. Sometimes that's useful. He paused. Sometimes it gets in the way. Nobody laughed this time, nobody argued, because the Ferrari was sitting right there proving the point. 100 experts had spent 6 hours searching for a difficult problem. Daniel had spent less than 3 minutes finding a simple one. The difference wasn't intelligence. The difference was perspective. Across the workshop, Isabella slowly climbed out of the Ferrari. Her expression had changed completely. The frustration was gone. The skepticism was gone. Now she looked at Daniel the way people look at something they don't fully understand. Because she didn't. Nothing about him made sense anymore. A delivery driver, a small independent mechanic, a man who looked completely ordinary. Yet he had solved a problem that some of the most qualified specialists in the industry couldn't solve. The explanation couldn't simply be luck. People didn't get lucky like that. Not in front of 100 professionals. Not with a $12 million Ferrari. Not after identifying the exact issue in under 3 minutes. Isabella walked toward him. The crowd immediately noticed. Employees moved aside. Managers stopped talking. The workshop became quiet again. Daniel looked exactly the same as before. No pride, no celebration, no attempt to enjoy the attention. If anything, he looked ready to leave, which somehow made the situation even stranger. Isabella stopped in front of him. Who are you? The question sounded simple. It wasn't. Daniel understood that so did everyone else, because nobody in the room was actually asking for his name. They already knew his name. It was printed on the delivery paperwork. What they wanted to know was something else entirely. Who was this man really? How did he know what nobody else knew? Why did he seem completely unimpressed by something everyone else considered extraordinary? Daniel looked toward the service desk. His signed paperwork was still sitting there. Then he looked back at Isabella. A slight smile appeared. The same calm smile he had worn all afternoon. My name is Daniel Carter. A few people laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because it wasn't the answer anyone wanted. Isabella shook her head. I know your name. Daniel nodded. I figured. The workshop remained silent, waiting. Then Isabella asked the question everyone was thinking. What kind of mechanic fixes a Ferrari in 3 minutes after 100 experts fail? Daniel considered that for a moment, then he answered. Probably the kind that spent 20 years working on Ferraris. The room froze, every conversation stopped, every expression changed, and suddenly the repair itself was no longer the biggest surprise of the day. For several seconds nobody spoke. The revelation landed differently than the repair itself. Fixing the Ferrari had been shocking. This was confusing, because if Daniel Carter had spent 20 years working on Ferraris, why was he making parts deliveries in a pickup truck? Why was he running a small 3-bay workshop on Harbor Lane? Why had nobody in the room heard of him? The questions appeared on faces throughout the workshop. Daniel could see them forming. He had seen them before. The assumptions people made about success were remarkably consistent. They assumed the best people always occupied the biggest buildings. They assumed expertise naturally led to visibility. They assumed talent inevitably attracted attention. Reality rarely worked that way. Isabella studied him. You worked for Ferrari? Daniel nodded. For a while. The understatement immediately irritated several technicians. One of the senior engineers stepped forward. A while? Daniel looked at him. About 20 years. The workshop fell silent again. The engineer blinked. You spent 20 years working on Ferraris and nobody here knows who you are. Daniel smiled. Most of my work wasn't public. That answer somehow created even more questions. Isabella folded her arms. What does that mean? Daniel looked toward the Ferrari, then back at her. It means I wasn't the guy giving interviews. A few people exchanged looks. Daniel continued. The industry likes public names. The people behind the cameras. The people standing beside finished cars. He shrugged. I preferred the work. The senior technician who had first spoken with him earlier suddenly frowned. Then something clicked. A memory, a name, a story. His eyes widened. No. Several people looked at him. The technician stared at Daniel. You're not that Daniel Carter. Daniel's expression immediately told him the answer. The technician actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because he couldn't believe it. Oh my God. Isabella looked between them. What? The technician pointed toward Daniel. 10 years ago. Nobody understood. The technician continued. The Enzo project. A few older specialists reacted immediately. Others didn't. The technician shook his head. The black Enzo from Modena. Now more people understood. The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel looked slightly uncomfortable, which confirmed everything. One of the engineers stared at him. That was you, Daniel sighed. It was a long time ago. The engineer looked genuinely stunned. The Enzo project was legendary within Ferrari restoration circles. One of those stories people heard during training. A heavily damaged Ferrari Enzo that multiple specialists had declared impossible to restore correctly. A project that eventually became one of the most celebrated restorations in modern Ferrari history. The lead technician responsible for solving several impossible structural and systems issues had never spoken publicly. Most people only knew the name, Daniel Carter, the same name standing in front of them now. The room changed, not dramatically. Instantly, the difference was subtle but unmistakable. Respect arrived, not because Daniel demanded it, because people finally understood who they were talking to. Isabella stared at him. Was you? Daniel nodded. The team was bigger than me, but you led it. A pause, then another nod. The workshop remained silent. A few younger mechanics were already searching their phones. Several older technicians simply shook their heads. An engineer sat down. The day had become increasingly difficult to process. Isabella looked at Daniel for a long moment. Then she asked the obvious question. If you did all of that, why leave? The question hung in the air. Daniel's expression softened slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. My wife got sick. The workshop became quiet again, a different kind of quiet. The kind people entered when they realized a story wasn't about mechanics anymore. Daniel continued calmly. Emma was 6. Nobody interrupted. The travel stopped making sense. The hours stopped making sense. A lot of things stopped making sense. He shrugged gently. So I came home. Simple, direct, no performance, no tragedy, just the truth. The room understood immediately. Some decisions didn't require explanation. Daniel continued. I opened Harbor Lane. Took projects I wanted to take. Picked up my daughter from school every afternoon. A slight smile appeared. Still do. For the first time all day, Isabella didn't see a mechanic. She saw a father. And somehow that explained more than all the technical achievements combined. The Ferrari, the Enzo, the restorations, the expertise. None of it seemed to matter as much as the fact that he had willingly walked away from prestige to be present for his daughter. Isabella glanced toward the Ferrari, then back at Daniel. I'd like to make you an offer. Several employees immediately looked interested. Daniel looked amused. You don't even know what offer you're making yet. I know enough. A few people laughed. Isabella continued. Consulting position. Technical director. Whatever title you want. Name your number. Several mechanics looked jealous. A few managers looked nervous. Daniel looked completely unaffected, which was becoming a pattern. He thought about it for several seconds, then shook his head. No, nobody expected that answer, especially Isabella. You didn't even ask what it pays. Daniel smiled. Because I already know I don't want the job, the workshop stared. Turning down an offer from Moretti Prestige Motors was not something people normally did, especially after a moment like this. Isabella crossed her arms. Then what do you want? Daniel looked around the workshop. At the technicians, the younger mechanics, the apprentices moving equipment near the back bays. Then he answered. Training. The room looked confused. Daniel continued. Every year there are young mechanics who love this work and never get a real opportunity to learn it properly. He pointed toward the workshop. Most companies say they train people. Several employees smiled. Because they knew exactly where this was going, Daniel smiled too. Most companies don't. Even Isabella laughed at that because it was true. Daniel continued. I'll help if you create an apprenticeship program. The room listened. Real training, real mentorship, real opportunities. A pause, not coffee runs. Several younger technicians laughed. Daniel looked at Isabella. 5 apprentices a year. The CEO considered it. The answer took less than 5 seconds. Done, Daniel nodded. Then we have a deal. The workshop erupted into applause, not because of the Ferrari, not even because of Daniel. Because everyone in the room understood they had just witnessed something rare. A person with extraordinary expertise who cared more about passing it on than profiting from it. Later that afternoon, Daniel finally climbed into his pickup truck and drove away. At exactly 3:15, he pulled into the school pickup line. Emma climbed into the passenger seat carrying her notebook. She took one look at his face and immediately smiled. Interesting day, Daniel laughed. You could say that. Emma opened the notebook. Tell me. Daniel started the truck, then he told her the story, the Ferrari, the mechanics, the CEO, the repair, everything. Emma listened quietly until he finished, then she wrote something in her notebook. Daniel glanced over. What did you write? She smiled, then turned the notebook so he could read it. The entry said, the loudest expert in the room isn't always the best one. Sometimes the smartest person is the one nobody notices. Daniel read it, then smiled. That's a good one. Emma nodded. I know. Outside, the afternoon sun settled over Harbor Lane. Inside the truck, a father and daughter drove home, and somewhere across town, 100 mechanics were still talking about the day a delivery driver fixed a Ferrari in 3 minutes.